The night it all began, I didn't think much of it. It was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of stillness that makes you notice every creak of the floorboards and the hum of distant sounds. My name is Emma, and this story is one I never thought I'd be telling. It's about me and my stepbrother, Jack. Jack came into my life when I was 17 after my adoption and our parents got married. At first, I wasn't sure how to feel about him. He had this calm, steady presence that felt intimidating at times but also grounding. I tried not to think of him as anything more than my stepbrother. I really did. That night, our parents had gone out for dinner, leaving just the two of us at home. It wasn't the first time, but somehow the house felt heavier, the air charged with something unspoken. I walked into the living room to find Jack sitting on the couch, his face lit by the dim glow of his phone. "You look bored," I said casually, though my voice carried a softness I couldn't quite mask. He looked up, startled for a moment, then shrugged. "Just killing time. What about you?" I walked over, sitting beside him on the couch, a little closer than necessary. Our knees brushed, and I felt a small spark. Not enough to make me flinch, but enough to make me hyper-aware of the space between us. "Same," I said with a small smile. "Just bored." He laughed nervously, his hand twitching against the armrest as he shifted. "You could watch TV or something." "Or something," I replied, leaning in slightly, just enough to catch his attention. Jack froze, his shoulders tense as I placed my hand on the couch near his. The small, daring part of me wanted to see how far I could push the unspoken boundary that seemed to exist between us. "We've never really talked, have we?" I said, my voice quiet. His brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We talk all the time." "Not like this," I said. "I mean really talked. You and I, we're not like most siblings, are we?" He didn't answer right away. I could see the discomfort in his posture, but there was something else, too, something unspoken that hung in the air between us. "Well," he said carefully, "we're not really siblings." I couldn't help but smile at that. "Exactly." The silence that followed was thick, charged with a tension that felt almost unbearable. I didn't move my hand away, and neither did he. "Emma," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "What are you doing?" I met his gaze, feeling a strange mix of nerves and defiance. "What do you think I'm doing?" For a moment, he looked as though he might say something, but then he fell silent, his eyes flicking to my lips before darting away. That small, almost imperceptible motion gave me the courage to lean closer. "Jack, we shouldn't," he started, but his voice faltered as I kissed him, soft, tentative, and full of uncertainty. The world seemed to stop in that moment. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't rational, but it was real. When we pulled away, the room felt impossibly still. Jack stared at me, his eyes wide and unreadable. "Emma," he began, but whatever he wanted to say didn't come out. I stood up quickly, brushing my hair back with a shaky hand. "Forget it," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "Wait," he said, standing up so fast he nearly tripped. I paused in the doorway, my back to him. For a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. "I don't want to make things weird," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't pretend I don't." I didn't finish the sentence. I couldn't. "Emma," he said, softer this time. I turned around slowly, meeting his gaze. His expression was conflicted, torn between hesitation and something deeper. And then, before I could second-guess myself, he crossed the room in 2 quick strides and kissed me again. This time it wasn't tentative. It was desperate, full of all the emotions neither of us could bring ourselves to say aloud. When we finally broke apart, I was breathless, my hands still tangled in his shirt. "What now?" I whispered. Jack didn't answer right away, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know," he said finally, "but we'll figure it out." That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying everything in my mind. I didn't know where this was headed, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The weight of my feelings for Jack lingered over me like a thick fog, impossible to shake. For weeks, I had avoided thinking too hard about what was happening between us. It wasn't just the kiss. It was everything that led to it, the stolen glances, the nervous tension that hummed between us whenever we were alone. I didn't know what I wanted, not exactly, but I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. That evening, our parents were out again. The house felt eerily still, the silence amplifying the pounding of my heartbeat as I sat in my room, staring at my reflection in the mirror. My fingers nervously traced the edge of my sweater. This is ridiculous, I thought.
Just talk to him.
Say something. Anything. I made my way downstairs, my footsteps soft against the creaking floorboards. Jack was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the TV, though I could tell by the way his shoulders were tense that he wasn't really watching. He seemed lost in his thoughts, his fingers drumming lightly against the armrest. "Hey," I said, my voice coming out quieter than I intended. He turned to look at me, startled, before offering a faint smile.
"Hey.
You okay?" I hesitated, debating whether I should back out, but the knot in my chest wouldn't loosen. "We need to talk," I blurted, my words sounding more serious than I'd intended. Jack frowned, sitting up straighter. "About what?" I moved to sit next to him, my knees brushing against his. The touch sent a small shiver up my spine, but I forced myself to focus. "About us," I said, meeting his gaze head-on. "About what we're doing." His eyes widened slightly, his atoms apple-bobbing as he swallowed. "Emma?" "Don't," I said quickly, holding up a hand to stop him. "Don't tell me it doesn't matter. Don't say it was a mistake." He froze, his mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. "I wasn't going to say that," he said finally, his voice low. "But it's complicated." I exhaled sharply, frustration bubbling in my chest. "I know it's complicated. Do you think I don't know that? But it's real, Jack. And pretending it isn't is driving me crazy." His hand twitched on the armrest, as if he wanted to reach out to me, but couldn't quite bring himself to do it. "I don't know what you want me to say," he admitted. "I want the truth," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "Do you feel the same way, or am I just imagining this?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the war he was waging with himself. Finally, he let out a shaky breath. "You're not imagining it," he said quietly. "I feel it too. I've been trying to fight it, but I can't." The relief that flooded through me was almost overwhelming. I hadn't realized how tightly I'd been holding on to my fear until it began to melt away. "Then stop fighting it," I said simply. Jack looked at me, his expression torn between fear and longing. And then, as if a dam had broken, he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was tentative at first, then desperate. It was as if all the emotions we'd been bottling up came pouring out in that moment. I didn't care about the consequences, about the impossibility of it all. All I cared about was him. The days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. We didn't talk about what had happened, but it hung in the air between us, an unspoken truth we couldn't ignore. Every glance, every accidental touch felt charged with a new intensity, as if we were walking a tightrope that could snap at any moment. I found myself replaying that night in my mind over and over again, analyzing every word, every touch. Was it reckless? Maybe. But it felt real in a way nothing else ever had. The turning point came one evening when our parents announced they'd be gone for the weekend. The news sent a jolt of nervous energy through me. I knew it was only a matter of time before Jack and I had to face whatever was happening between us. That Saturday, I suggested we watch a movie to pass the time. I told myself it was innocent, but deep down I knew better. We sat on the couch, the space between us feeling both impossibly close and unbearably far. My fingers toyed with the hem of my shirt as I tried to focus on the screen, but my attention kept drifting to Jack. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "Jack," I said, turning to face him. "We need to talk." His jaw tightened, and he paused the movie, setting the remote down with deliberate care. "About what?" "About us," I said, the words rushing out before I could stop them. His eyes searched mine, and for a moment, I thought he might deny it, brush it off like he always did. But then he nodded, his shoulders sagging as if he'd been carrying the weight of those words himself. "What about us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I reached for his hand, my fingers brushing against his. Whatever this is, it matters to me," I said.
You matter to me.
"And I don't want to keep pretending it doesn't." For a long moment, he didn't say anything. Then, slowly, he turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with mine. "I don't want to pretend either," he admitted. "But I don't know how to make this work." "We'll figure it out," I said softly. Together. The days following our conversation were some of the most surreal of my life. Jack and I had crossed a line, and we both knew it. But instead of feeling ashamed or uncertain, I felt alive. It was as if the world had gone from grayscale to vibrant color overnight. Every glance we exchanged carried a hidden meaning. Every accidental brush of his hand against mine sent a jolt through me. It was intoxicating and terrifying all at once. But the more time I spent around Jack, the more I realized just how much I wanted him. One morning, I was in the kitchen making coffee when Jack walked in, his hair messy and his t-shirt wrinkled. He looked at me, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world didn't exist. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but warm. "Morning," I replied, unable to keep the smile off my face. We stood there in silence, the sound of the coffee maker filling the air. He moved closer, reaching around me to grab a mug from the cabinet. For a moment, his hand brushed my back, and I froze, my heart pounding. It wasn't just the touch, it was the way he lingered, his breath warm against my neck. "Emma," he said quietly, his voice laced with hesitation. I turned to face him, our bodies close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. "What?" His eyes searched mine, as if trying to find the right words. "We're going to get caught if we're not careful." I let out a small laugh, though the seriousness in his tone made my stomach twist. "Maybe. But doesn't that make it more exciting?" "Exciting," he repeated, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You're impossible." "Maybe," I said, leaning closer. "But you don't seem to mind." Before he could respond, I kissed him, the taste of coffee lingering on his lips. It was brief but electric, and when I pulled away, his expression was a mix of amusement and exasperation. "We're playing with fire, Emma," he said, though there was no real conviction in his voice. "Then let's burn," I whispered. Despite our attempts to keep things under wraps, the tension between us was impossible to hide. It seeped into every interaction, every conversation, until even our parents started to notice. One evening, during dinner, my mom glanced between us with a curious expression. "You two seem to be getting along better lately," she said, her tone light but probing. Jack stiffened, his fork pausing midway to his mouth.
Yeah.
"I guess so." "That's good," she said, smiling. "I was starting to worry you'd never warm up to each other." I forced a laugh, hoping it sounded natural. "Well, it just took some time." Her words stuck with me long after the conversation ended. Were we really being that obvious? And if so, how long before someone put the pieces together? The breaking point came on a Saturday night. Our parents were hosting a small dinner party, and the house was filled with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. Jack and I spent most of the evening avoiding each other, keeping a safe distance to avoid suspicion. But as the night wore on, I found myself drawn to him, my eyes constantly drifting in his direction. He was standing by the kitchen, talking to one of our neighbors, when his gaze met mine. The look he gave me was enough to make my knees weak, a mixture of longing, frustration, and something deeper that I couldn't quite name. Without thinking, I excused myself and slipped upstairs, my heart racing as I closed the door to my room. I barely had time to collect my thoughts before there was a soft knock. "Emma?" Jack's voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I opened the door, and before I could say anything, he stepped inside, closing it behind him. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice low. "I know," I whispered. For a moment, we just stood there, the air between us crackling with tension. And then, as if pulled by some invisible force, he closed the distance between us, his lips crashing against mine. The kiss was different this time, desperate, almost frantic, as if we were both trying to hold on to something we knew we couldn't keep. When we finally pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, his breath ragged. "This is going to end badly," he said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe," I said, my fingers brushing against his cheek. "But I don't care." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying what had happened. I knew Jack was right. We were walking a dangerous line, and the longer we stayed on it, the more likely we were to fall. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself to stop, I knew I wouldn't. Whatever this was, whatever we were, it felt too real, too important to let go. After that night, things between Jack and me became even more complicated. Every moment we spent together felt like balancing on the edge of a knife. We were careful, but no amount of caution could completely hide what was happening between us. The glances that lingered too long, the subtle touches when no one was looking, the tension that seemed to fill the air whenever we were in the same room, it was all there, simmering beneath the surface. I couldn't help but wonder if we were fooling anyone, or if people were just too polite to say anything. Our parents remained blissfully unaware, or at least that's what I told myself. But I wasn't blind to the curious looks my mom sometimes gave me, or the way Jack's dad occasionally seemed to study us with a little too much interest. I knew we were playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. One afternoon, I found myself alone in the house. Our parents had gone out for the day, and Jack had taken the car to run some errands. I was supposed to be working on a paper for school, but my thoughts kept drifting back to him. I was sitting at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through my phone, when the door opened and Jack walked in. His hair was windswept, and there was a faint flush on his cheeks from the cold. "You're back early," I said, trying to sound casual. He shrugged, setting the car keys on the counter. "I figured I'd pick up lunch on way back. Thought you might be hungry." He held up a paper bag, and I couldn't help but smile. "You know me too well." He sat across from me, unpacking the food as if it were the most normal thing in the world. But the way his knee brushed against mine under the table told a different story. For a while, we ate in silence, the only sound the crinkle of wrappers and the hum of the fridge. But I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally looked up, his expression was serious. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. I set down my drink, my stomach twisting. "About what?" "You know what?" he said, leaning forward.
This. Us.
I swallowed hard, my pulse quickening. "What about us?" He let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "Emma, you know this isn't sustainable. What we're doing, it's going to blow up in our faces sooner or later." I frowned, my chest tightening. "So what are you saying?" "That we should stop." "I don't know," he admitted, his voice softening. "But I don't want to hurt you. And I don't want to hurt them." He didn't have to say who he meant. We both knew how devastating it would be if our parents found out. "And what about what we want?" I asked, my voice trembling. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, I saw the same conflict in his eyes that had been eating away at me for weeks. "I don't know," he said again. I don't know how to do this." That conversation stuck with me long after it ended. Jack wasn't wrong. What we were doing was reckless, selfish even. But knowing that didn't make it any easier to stop. If anything, it made me want him more. The tipping point came one evening when our parents announced they were hosting a family dinner. It was supposed to be a casual gathering, just a few relatives and close friends. But the idea of spending an entire evening pretending everything was normal felt like torture. I spent most of the night avoiding Jack, keeping my distance and making polite small talk with relatives I barely knew. But I could feel his presence in the room, like a magnetic pull I couldn't resist. At one point, I caught him watching me from across the room, his expression unreadable. The intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down my spine, and I had to excuse myself, retreating to the bathroom to catch my breath. When I finally came out, the hallway was empty, or so I thought. "Emma." I froze at the sound of his voice, my heart racing as I turned to see Jack standing a few feet away. "What are you doing?" I whispered, glancing nervously over my shoulder. "I needed to talk to you," he said, stepping closer.
"Now?"
I hissed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, now," he said, his tone firm. I can't keep doing this, Emma. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. What are you saying? I'm saying we need to figure this out, he said, his voice softening. Because I can't keep pretending I don't care about you. But I also can't stand the thought of losing you. Or them. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I looked away, my chest tightening.
Jack, this isn't fair, I said.
You're asking me to choose between what I want and what's right. I'm not asking you to choose, he said, stepping closer. I'm just asking you to be honest with me. With yourself. For a moment, we stood there in silence, the weight of his words hanging in the air. And then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us, pulling him into a desperate kiss. It was messy and frantic, full of all the emotions we couldn't put into words. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his breath ragged. This is going to destroy us, isn't it? I whispered. Maybe, he said, his voice barely audible. But I'd rather destroy myself than lose you. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my mind. I didn't know what was going to happen next, but one thing was clear. There was no going back now. By the time everything unraveled, I suppose part of me knew it was inevitable. Jack and I had been walking a dangerous line, one that was bound to snap beneath us sooner or later. And when it did, the fallout was worse than anything I'd imagined. It started with a misplaced glance. We were at dinner again, our parents laughing and sharing stories as Jack and I sat across from each other. I tried to focus on my plate, on the meaningless conversations swirling around us, but I could feel his gaze on me. And then I looked up. It was only for a second, but that second was enough. His expression was soft, full of something I couldn't hide, and didn't want to. My mom's laughter faltered, and she glanced between us with a curious tilt of her head. You two have been spending a lot of time together lately, she said lightly, though there was an edge to her tone. I felt my stomach twist, panic bubbling beneath the surface. We just get along better now, I said quickly, forcing a smile. But the look she gave me told me she wasn't convinced. After that night, things spiraled quickly. My mom started asking questions, small ones at first, casual and seemingly harmless. But as the days went on, her curiosity became harder to dismiss. Are you okay, Emma? She asked one afternoon while we were folding laundry. Yeah, why wouldn't I be? I said, keeping my tone as casual as possible. She hesitated, her hands pausing mid-fold. You just seem distracted lately. Like something's on your mind. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. I'm fine, Mom.
Really?
She didn't press further, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't letting it go. The breaking point came a week later. I was in my room, going over notes for an upcoming exam, when there was a knock at the door. Come in, I called, expecting it to be my mom. But it wasn't. Jack stepped inside, closing the door behind him. His expression was tense, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. What's wrong? I asked, setting my notebook aside. They know, he said, his voice low. The blood drained from my face. What? They haven't said it outright, but they know, Emma. Or at least they suspect. I stood, my heart pounding in my chest.
How?
How could they know? He ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. I don't know. Maybe it was the way we've been acting, or maybe we weren't as careful as we thought. But they're not stupid, Emma. And it's only a matter of time before they confront us. I felt the room spin, my thoughts racing. What do we do? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. We tell them the truth. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Are you serious? Jack, if we tell them, they deserve to know, he said, cutting me off. And I'm tired of hiding. I'm tired of pretending. His voice softened, and he took a step closer. I know this is scary, but we can't keep living like this. If they can't accept it, then we'll deal with that. Together. I stared at him, my chest tightening with fear and love all at once. Jack, this could ruin everything. He reached for my hand, his touch grounding me. Or it could set us free. The conversation that followed was the hardest thing I'd ever done. We sat our parents down in the living room, the tension in the air so thick it was almost suffocating. Jack did most of the talking, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was saying. When he finished, there was silence. My mom looked at me, her expression a mixture of shock, confusion, and hurt. "Emma," she said quietly, "how long has this been going on?" I hesitated, glancing at Jack before meeting her gaze. "A while," I admitted. "But it's not what you think. This isn't some fling. It's real." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "This isn't right, Emma. Your family—" "We're not," Jack said firmly, his voice cutting through the room. "We're not blood. And we've tried to fight this, but we can't. We love each other." The word hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The fallout was messy. Our parents didn't scream or yell, but the disappointment in their eyes was worse than any anger could have been. For weeks, the house felt like a battlefield, every conversation charged with unspoken tension. My mom could barely look at me, and Jack's dad seemed lost in his own thoughts, as if trying to process what had happened. But through it all, Jack was my anchor. He held me when I cried, reassured me when I doubted, and reminded me that no matter what, we had each other. It wasn't easy, but over time, things began to settle. Our parents never fully understood, but they learned to accept it, if only because they saw how much we meant to each other. And as for Jack and me, we faced the world together, hand in hand, determined to build a life that was ours and ours alone. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And that was enough.